Casey, now we can hear you.
Fantastic.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah.
Excellent. All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to join you today. I will get on with sharing my screen and hope that the technology will work.
Excellent.
Okay.
Yeah, that works.
Is it working? Fantastic.
Yes, it does. Excellent. Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you so much for the opportunity to contribute to the discussion. I'm Kathy Mulvey. I direct the Fossil Fuel Company Accountability Campaign with the Union of Concerned Scientists. And it's really an honor to have the opportunity to present to the Commission. So the Union of Concerned Scientists, UCS, is a leading US-based, science-based advocacy organization. We work on behalf of about 500,000 members and supporters on issues ranging from climate change to global security to democratic, scientific integrity and democratic decision-making. And we mobilize a network of more than 25,000 scientists and experts to do that. So I'm here to present the findings and recommendations of UCS's Climate Accountability Scorecard on Royal Dutch Shell. Last October, UCS published an update to our Climate Accountability Scorecard, which first came out in 2016. And I'll provide both an overview of the methodology and our key findings, but also some of the recommendations for Shell, one of the 8 companies that we studied. The UCS campaign takes as its jumping off point arguments that were put forth by my UCS colleague, Peter Frumhoff, who I know has testified before the Commission, along with Rick Heady and Naomi Oreskes, about the climate responsibilities of industrial carbon polluters and producers. And a UCS research team developed a methodology to evaluate fossil energy companies' performance and progress in the first 4 areas above, and used that methodology to study the climate-related communications, positions, and actions of 8 major investor-owned oil and gas companies. And in doing so, we consulted with outside experts and drew on existing resources. We scored each of the metrics on a 5-point scale, with advanced at the top, representing best practice, and egregious at the bottom, signifying severe irresponsibility. We calculated an aggregate score for each company in each of these 4 broad areas, but did not give a total score because we found that tends to obscure differences between companies rather than shedding light on them. And we didn't assess company performance in the 5th area, paying their share of the costs of climate damages and adaptation, as no fossil fuel company has even begun to do so. So as in 2016, we studied 8 investor-owned fossil energy companies. And thanks to Rick Heady's groundbreaking research, which we've heard about today, we know that these 8 companies have contributed about 14% of global energy-related carbon dioxide and methane emissions that are driving disruptive climate change. And I know that last year, the Honorable Commission heard from UCS Director of Climate Science, Brenda Eckwurzel, about a study that links emissions from the products of fossil fuel producers, including Shell, to changes in the global climate. So, this study found that emissions from the extraction and products of 90 major fossil fuel producers and cement manufacturers contributed about 30% of global sea level rise between 1880 and 2010. And I think we've seen a similar graph from Carol. Shown here are the contributions of the top 20 investor-owned and majority state-owned companies to the historical rise in global mean surface temperature. So now let's see how well Shell is meeting emerging societal expectations for responsible action on climate change. UCS's assessment, not well enough. Shell scored good in 1 area, fair in 2, and poor in the 4th. And from 2016 to 2018, we found that the company's score improved in 2 areas, but dropped in one area and remained the same in one area. So I'll spend the rest of my time digging into the details of UCS's analysis and how Shell compares to some of its peers and competitors. And we'll start in the area where Shell scored worst, and all of the companies that UCS studied are falling short of emerging societal expectation. That is, to what extent are they renouncing disinformation on climate science and policy? As UCS and others have documented, major fossil energy companies have a long history of funding campaigns to sow doubt about climate change. And we've heard several times today about this internal roadmap memo by the American Petroleum Institute, so I won't go into further detail about that. But despite public relations claims to the contrary, most of the companies in our study continue to mischaracterize climate science. Shell actually offers the best example of consistently accurate public statements on climate science and the need for swift and deep reductions in emissions from the burning of fossil fuels. But these days, however, groups like the American Petroleum Institute, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the US Chamber of Commerce continue to spread disinformation on climate science and policy. So as an example, API's 2017 Climate Change and Energy Primer blatantly omits the need to reduce global warming emissions, the risks of burning fossil fuels, and the science of climate change. And in 2017, the National Association of Manufacturers launched the ironically named Manufacturers Accountability Project to discredit the lawsuits filed by US municipalities for climate change damages. So this initiative has really been an active advocate for the fossil fuel industry in its fight to avoid accountability for the harms caused by its products. And if we then look at indirect disinformation by the companies in our study, we find that all 8 of them maintain membership in trade associations and other industry-affiliated groups that spread disinformation about climate science and seek to block climate action. And each company holds at least one leadership position in such a group. And Shell is no exception. On the positive side, Shell left the American Legislative Exchange Council in 2015 and stated explicitly that it was leaving because ALEC's position on climate science is inaccurate and inconsistent with its own. But Shell holds leadership roles in API, NAM, and the US Chamber of Commerce, and it's also a member of the Western States Petroleum Association. And in none of these cases has Shell taken steps to distance itself from climate disinformation spread by these groups. So the business groups that Shell pays to lobby on its behalf don't actually support the company's stated positions on climate change, and thus Shell scores poor overall in this area. We'll turn now to the second area, which is planning for a world free from carbon pollution. And the oil and gas companies in our sample have really made headlines since the Paris Climate Agreement, in some cases for pledges to reduce emissions, in others for staying the course and really asserting that they can continue to profit from extracting fossil fuels. Shareholder engagement has actually helped to lead to the production of 9 so-called 2C reports by these companies, which are reports that disclose how they plan to adapt to a world in which global temperature increase is kept well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And these reports are a start, but they have a number of gaps. And the reality is that none of these companies has set a company-wide net zero emissions target that's consistent with the Paris Climate Agreement's global temperature goal. So as we heard from Lowry and earlier from Greg, despite all the fanfare about Shell's Sky scenario, it relies on a 200-fold increase in the deployment of carbon capture and storage by 2050, without revealing a coherent plan for how such an increase would be paid for and actually achieved. So thus, despite a positive score on one metric, its disclosure of greenhouse gas emissions, Shell scores only fair in this area. Now let's look at the third area, supporting fair and effective climate policies. And by and large, the fossil energy industry was late to come to the Paris Climate Agreement party. So more than 3 years after the adoption of the Paris Climate Agreement, all 5 of the oil and gas companies in our sample have made claims to support policies or regulations to advance it. However, when we studied these claims further, only Shell explicitly supported the global temperature goal and the net zero emissions target in the Paris Agreement. So Shell's general support for policies to advance the Paris Agreement has helped the company earn a score of good in this area, joining ConocoPhillips and ExxonMobil. But it's worth noting that that some scores in this area are deceptively high. First, UCS's scorecard focuses on U.S. climate policies, and there were no major federal climate policies under consideration in our study period. And furthermore, there were limited company statements on federal rollbacks. They relied heavily on the friendly Trump administration, as well as their trade and industry groups that we talked about previously. So metrics that, as part of this area, that are based on the Center for Political Accountability Zicklin Index of Corporate Disclosure and Governance of Political Activity, were actually more heavily weighted. And Shell and several of the other companies studied got credit for transparency and oversight of corporate political expenditures. I want to stress that they haven't been scored on positions taken by the recipients of their corporate campaign contributions or on whether their lobbying and political spending is consistent with stated corporate positions. So I'll wrap up my presentation with the fourth area, which is fully disclosing climate risks. The Task Force on Climate-Related Financial Disclosures, TCFD, recommended that companies include information on material climate risks in their mainstream financial findings. And UCS examined these disclosures on 4 metrics: physical risks to their own operations, regulatory risks, market and other indirect risks, and corporate governance on climate-related risks. And we consider the rise of climate liability lawsuits as a material factor for companies like Shell. So in the US, state and local governments, and most recently the fishing industry, have chosen to take these companies to court because they haven't seen the changes they want to see represented in legislation or in company action. These cases claim that companies knew about the risks of climate change and didn't do enough to prepare the public or mitigate the problem. So they are asking companies to pay their fair share in climate damages like sea level rise adaptation. Lawsuits against the carbon majors have been filed by 8 cities and counties in California, New York City, municipalities in Colorado and Washington State, the state of Rhode Island, and most recently the Pacific Coast Federation of Fishermen's Associations. And recently, New York's Attorney General sued ExxonMobil for defrauding shareholders by downplaying climate risks to its business. So I think what this trend indicates is that we may see actually 3 streams of climate litigation against the fossil fuel companies develop: claims that arise from the impacts of their emissions from their operations and from the use of their products, claims that are related to misleading or inaccurate disclosures and reporting of climate risks, and claims that arise from losses due to their failure to manage physical or transition risks. So in its 2018 financial filings, Shell acknowledged climate liability lawsuits as a potential climate-related risk and discussed how the company may be affected by other indirect risks from climate change, such as diminished demand for fossil fuels. So it scored fair on this particular metric, and like most of the companies that UCS studied, Shell scored fair overall in this area. So based on this analysis, UCS made specific recommendations to Royal Dutch Shell. We called on the company to use its leadership positions within API, NAM, the National Association of Manufacturers, and the U.S. Chamber to demand an end to those groups' disinformation on climate science and policy, and to actually speak publicly about those efforts. We called on Shell to develop and publicly communicate a company-wide plan to bring Shell's emissions of heat-trapping gases from its operations and from the use of its products to net zero by mid-century. So very similar to what the Friends of the Earth lawsuit in the Netherlands is seeking. We called on the company to consistently call for U.S. policy action on climate change, identify specific federal and/or state legislation or regulation that the company supports, and advocate publicly and transparently for those policies. And then in the area of physical risk, to provide details about the nature and magnitude of climate-related physical risks it faces and the impacts that these may have on the company, as well as a detailed analysis of existing and proposed laws and regulations relating to climate change and how they may affect the company. So as I said, this report came out in October, and in just a few months, there have been important developments. So as people probably know, the Climate Action 100 Plus is a coordinated effort by investors to engage with the highest emitting companies over a set of specific demands. It seeks commitments by these companies to take action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions across their value chains, consistent with the Paris Agreement's global temperature goals. And last month, Climate Action 100 Plus and Shell issued a joint statement on steps the company has agreed to take to demonstrate alignment with the Paris goals. Shell will set goals and track progress on its carbon footprint on a short-term basis and link executive compensation to progress meeting these goals. And that step garnered considerable press coverage, including about some of its limitations, which we've heard about today. There was less fanfare for the company's commitment to better align its climate lobbying with its stated positions, a move that's increasingly called for by shareholders at Shell and at other fossil fuel companies. And this is actually a step that's necessary if Shell wants to differentiate itself from its industry peers by making a clean break from climate disinformation. So this joint statement is an important development. It echoes many of the recommendations that came from our analysis, but UCS and active shareholders will really be watching closely to make sure that Shell follows through on its commitments. So I guess we're going to take questions on the last several presentations. Okay, so should I give control back over to you for that? Real.
Thank you, Katie. Thank you very much. That was very clear, and it was very good that you also listened to the earlier presentation, so you could perfectly complement those.
All right.
Anybody has a question for Katie? Kristen, you want to come over here?
Maybe you can say it to her, but in the study of the 8 companies, in their filings, did any of them mention the investigation, the national inquiry being conducted by the Commission on Human Rights of the Philippines?
Very great question, Kristen. And we did not find that explicitly. We did see the liability litigation in the U.S. mentioned specifically in 3 of the filings, I believe.
Thank you for your presentation, Kathy. This is very interesting because you categorized the accountability scorecard in different in 4 areas. But in totality, how would you score Shell in totality?
Yeah, that's a good question. So Shell was among the higher scoring companies overall in several of the areas, and at the same time, we found in 2018, as we did in 2016, that it wasn't that useful to to come up with a full aggregate score, because part of the purpose of this analysis is really to begin to differentiate among fossil energy companies and help create some incentives for some of them to distinguish themselves from their peers and competitors by performing better on climate-related metrics. And if we fold everything into a single score, the differences between the companies are actually smaller. So I think it's most helpful to look at it in terms of those four broad areas, and so Shell was kind of around the neither positive or negative in two of the areas, somewhat positive in terms of its support for fair and effective climate policies, but as I mentioned, there are some limitations to what we can analyze in that area, in part because of a lack of transparency about what they're actually doing with their lobbying. And then, it's a huge concern that all of the companies that we examined are still supporting the spread of disinformation on climate science and policy, despite a lot of public relations that's kind of giving them credit for accepting climate science now. So that's what I would say to that.
Okay, thank you, Katie.
Great.
Thank you very much
Thanks a lot.
for your
Sorry,
contribution.
can I just
Oh.
have another one?
Yeah, Hasmina.
I'm just interested on this slide on metric consistently accurate public statements on climate science, wherein Shell actually got an advanced score. Do these public statements accurately reflect what they are currently doing? Because according to other experts who presented earlier, they are actually I'm not sure if I got it correctly, but these are actually lip service or are just better in paper but not translated into action.
Yeah, and I think where we dig into that, so we look at the company's websites and what they say and whether they're actually internally consistent in their statements. We look at public statements by company representatives and the executives, and we actually had, if you saw on that slide, BP scored good on that same metric. And again, this is their own direct statements. It's not what the trade and industry groups or lobby groups that they're part of say, and we believe that these companies ought to be held accountable for what trade and industry groups say. But so BP had actually, when in our initial scoring, was scored egregious because the company had some climate disinformation on its website, and when we brought that statement to the company's attention, it actually corrected the website and made it more consistent with accepted climate science. So I think maybe what the question here is whether the actions of the company match the words, and we certainly found that that limitations in terms of whether the company is actually making business plans that are consistent with its stated acceptance of climate science, right? And in that case, just as with all of the companies in our study, we found that none of them have actually made a business plan that is consistent with reaching net zero emissions by mid-century, which is what we know is necessary to avoid the worst effects of climate change.
Yep.
Maybe if I just might ask for a little bit more information there. I'm assuming I will find it in the accountability scorecard, but this is coming from a concerned scientist, and the basic, evaluation from good to poor, if you like, sounds very relative. Are there clearer definitions of what that means? Because we translate that socially. It's like a child in school. Well, he's done poorly this year. He might do better next year. we need a tighter rein, in a sense, on clarity on the concept. So I'm assuming I will find that if I look for the climate ability scorecard that's identified on image 2.
Yes, and I can refer you, so that the scorecard itself is a kind of high-level report with highlights and lowlights. There is a fact sheet that's specifically focused on Shell, and that gives both the score on each of the 28 metrics as well as a brief description of how the company got that score. And then if you want to understand sort of what it would take to get a positive score on any of these metrics, we do have a detailed methodology document available online that says, what's required to achieve a score of advanced or good on any of these metrics. And I'm happy to share those links with Case so that he can forward them along to the commission.
Thank you.
Great.
Okay, Katie. Yeah,
All
if
right.
you could forward
All right.
that would be excellent.
Yes, will do.
Yeah.
Great. Thanks a lot.
Thank you very
Thank
much for
you.
attending.
Thank you.
And
Yes,
taking
thank you
your
for
time.
inviting me. Bye-bye.
Speak soon.